So good afternoon. Welcome to the Newsroom Pub. I'm Milwaukee Press Club President-elect Tom Dakin. Happy to be here today with a former colleague, former Washington Bureau Chief of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and current Lubar Fellow at the Marquette University Law School, Craig Gilbert. During his 35 years at the Journal Sentinel, Gilbert's reporting analysis detailed Wisconsin's emerging role as one of the nation's leading battleground states. Craig, who has covered every presidential campaign since 1988, also has written extensively about competition for the swing states of the industrial Midwest, the region's shifting political map, its increasingly polarized political culture, and the deepening urban-rural divide. His work has been recognized by editor and publisher, the National Press Foundation, the National Headliner Awards, the Milwaukee Press Club, and the Columbia Journalism Review. He's continued to provide that analysis in his work at the Lubar Center since retiring from the Journal Sentinel in 2022. Now, before we get started, I want to thank our event sponsors. Our presenting sponsor is Spectrum News One. Our supporting sponsor is We Energies. And I'd also like to thank our event partner, WisPolitics.com, which partners with the Press Club for this luncheon and is part of an ongoing event series in Milwaukee. Other sponsors of that event series are University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and Milwaukee Academy of Global Education and Training, 1125 at Pabst, Medical College of Wisconsin, the Commercial Association of Realtors, and Spectrum. And finally, I would also like to welcome Jeff Myers, president of WisPolitics.com. He will join Craig for a conversation about the presidential race, Wisconsin's U.S. Senate race between incumbent Democrat Tammy Baldwin and Republican challenger Eric Hovde, and other top races in contention in Wisconsin and the country. And now please welcome Craig Gilbert.
Okay, we're just going to get into the Q&A. But first, a plug for the election guide, printed election guide that WisPolitics has done. You can pick one up at the front counter. That's your study guide for today's session, a quiz to follow. So Craig and I have known each other way too long, back to the Tommy Thompson days.
This is a reunion of the 1990 gubernatorial campaign press corps, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we were there. Okay, so we've been across Wisconsin. Craig probably has been to many more events than I have, campaign events, and there's no shortage of visits here in Wisconsin. You have your pick, right? So, I mean, that means Wisconsin's still on the map, right?
It's at the epicenter of this election, as usual.
Yeah. So I just want to get this out of the way. Who's going to win?
So I've already gotten that question about 8 times since I arrived at the pub. So I kind of reconciled myself some time ago to the fact that I would go into election night without a clear sense or even a strong suspicion about who was going to win, either Wisconsin or nationally, and it's all kind of going according to plan. When Joe Biden was in the race, you could talk yourself into Donald Trump kind of opening up a lot of daylight in this race. And then when Kamala Harris replaced him and had her kind of surge of enthusiasm, and you could talk yourself into maybe her opening up a little daylight. But I don't see much daylight between them right now. And, we get worked up about what appear to be small, in some cases, barely discernible trends in the polling. But again, polling is a relatively crude instrument, especially when the natural variation in the polls is significantly larger than the margin between the candidates. And when you've got this just insane situation in the Electoral College where you have basically 6 or 7 toss-up states. And they're all within a point or two of each other in the polling. And so it's kind of like, having 7 dice and rolling them all at the same time on a table and seeing how they come up. I mean, that's kind of the way. There's kind of a random quality to this because the assumptions I make are that, in the case of Wisconsin, parts of Wisconsin are going to get redder, parts of Wisconsin are going to get bluer, and it's going to be a close race, and it probably won't deviate too much from the last race because Democrats are going to make gains in this region and Republicans are going to make gains in that region. And so I'm no help at all on who's going to win this race.
No, that's not true. We're gonna set the stage for the ultimate winner that will be decided on November 5. Okay, so let's just talk about these. Let's talk about the national first, and then let's get into Wisconsin, because as you said, there's these 7 toss-up states, and every one of them, according to the polling averages, seems to be really, really close. But I'm wondering whether this is a function of this short campaign. Harris didn't become the nominee until mid-August, and then that reset the race, and now maybe it's an abbreviated, duration. Mm-hmm. Does that have something to do with it?
I think it has something to do with it, but I think it's just more about where we are politically. Obviously, we're very polarized. We're very evenly divided. Even with all the dramatic things that have happened in the last 6 months, changing candidates, having conventions, an assassination attempt, choosing running mates, everything that's happened in the world, the numbers have not bounced around very much. They really haven't moved very much. And so I think that's just kind of the territory, the place we're living in with respect to this race. There's not a lot of movement, and that's, if you look at a world in which, Democratic voters are almost entirely voting for Kamala Harris and Republican voters are, maybe a few more defectors, but almost entirely voting for Donald Trump, and then you have this sort of dwindling number of voters in play, swing voters, and those voters, may or may not vote in the end. If they're undecided, that also means they may just stay home, but the ones that will vote are kind of, pollsters refer to them as being cross-pressured. They're pulled in different directions. Like in the Marquette polling, in the last 2 polls, where we had Kamala Harris being ahead in Wisconsin by a few points, this goes back to September, what it showed about the undecideds was that because she had entirely consolidated the Democratic voters, the undecideds were almost entirely Republicans and independents, and mostly moderates, and also mostly people that didn't like either candidate. So you've got conflicted partisans like Republicans that really want to vote for Donald Trump but have real qualms about him, and then you've got some independent voters that don't like either candidate, and so they don't know what to do. And so that's, we've seen a little bit of this before too. I mean, famously in 2016, Donald Trump, who had much more negative, even more negative numbers then than he does now, just, if you believe the exit polls, the clear majority of undecided voters, late deciding voters, and double haters, people that didn't like either him or Hillary Clinton, they broke for him at the end, and that's how he won the election. And there's a lot fewer double haters now. There were fewer double haters in 2020 because Joe Biden was actually fairly popular in 2020, and Donald Trump was, less unpopular because he'd been the president, and Republican voters, liked him. And some independents liked him. And now, we're down to a smaller group of double haters again, nothing like 2016. So again, it's a marginal campaign and a marginal election.
Okay, so there was a Marquette Law School poll that came out today, a national poll, not a state poll. There's another state poll coming out later this month, but this is a national poll. And it showed, the race virtually tied. But I think that some of the results are indicative of what all the swing states are going through right now. And do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, the polling nationally is very tight, and the polling in all these swing states is very tight. There's a little bit of one of the X factors, or one of the questions that everybody scratches their head about is there going to be this disconnect between the Electoral College and the national popular vote like we've seen in the last 2 elections? I mean, I'm old enough, and a lot of you are old enough to remember in 2000 when we had a different outcome in the national popular vote and the Electoral College. But going into that election, everybody thought it would work the other way around. They thought if there was a split between the Electoral College and the popular vote, it would be Republican George W. Bush winning the popular vote and Democrat Al Gore winning the Electoral College. And now it works the other way. But, you know, it's a little bit unpredictable because the Electoral College advantage is not just a function of the fact that, you know, Republicans have an edge because they do well in a lot of small states, and the way the Electoral College math works, you know, every state has 2 votes for each senator, so it's disproportionately a small state effect. But also it's just, you know, the randomness of winning or losing states by tiny amounts has profound consequences. And so, you know, Joe Biden won all these close states last time, but Donald Trump won them the time before. And so we don't know if there's going to be that same gap. I mean, the gap between the national popular vote and then the tipping point battleground state is how people measure the Electoral College bias. And it was, I think, in the 2016 election, it was like 2 points, but then it was like 4 points in the 2020 election. Most people expect it to be smaller this time around for a variety of reasons. So if you assume there's a significant Electoral College bias for Republicans and you see a poll that's 50-50 nationally, that's obviously not good for Kamala Harris. But if the Electoral College bias is significantly smaller than that, then it doesn't necessarily tell you who's going to win the Electoral College, especially when all these states are way within the margin of error. Okay,
so I want to go more into this poll, and you can find that this poll online at Marquette University Law School. So both candidates are underwater in terms of favorability, but when all the third-party or independent candidates are listed, Harris has a 44-41 lead. Now, Wisconsin has a crowded ballot. So how much of a factor are these others, and RFK Jr. included? How could they affect the ultimate winner?
The short answer is if the race is close enough, anything can affect it. I mean, you know, the Tim Walz effect in Superior, Wisconsin can affect it because, you know, 7% of Wisconsin voters live in a Minnesota media market.
They think he's governor.
They think he's governor, yeah, and they cheer for the Vikings. Probably not, but if the race is close enough, you know, all these little marginal things can have can tip the outcome in theory. I've always been a little skeptical about the spoiler scenarios. In 2016, a lot of people remember that the Jill Stein vote was bigger than Hillary Clinton's losing margin statewide, and so
most Democrats really remember that.
Yeah,
right?
and they conclude from that Jill Stein cost Hillary Clinton the election. I do not believe that, and I don't believe it because the assumption people make about these third-party candidates is that if they weren't on the ballot, all those people would be voting anyway. And that's not true. If you're voting for a third-party candidate at the end of a campaign for president, it means you really, really, really don't want to vote for either of the major party candidates. So there's a good chance you're just not going to vote. You really don't want to pull the ballot for one of the other two. And if you're, you know, the spoiler argument is not really persuading you. And so, yeah, if you believe that all those Jill Stein voters would have voted, and then that they would have voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton, and then if you discount the third-party candidates on the right and forget about their impact, then yeah, you could sort of make the case. But it's not a very persuasive case to me, but that is not to dismiss the possibility that it could affect this race. But what's interesting about the poll you're talking about, of course, is that Kamala Harris has a better margin, right? When you include the third-party candidates. She's up by 1 without, I think in the 1-to-1 matchup, but she's up by 3 when you include RFK and the other candidates, which is not the dynamic people thought it would be when Joe Biden was still in the race. And a lot of Democrats were worried about these third-party candidates, and now Democrats seem happy to have RFK on the ballot.
Well, right, but in Wisconsin, the Republicans were trying to get RFK off the ballot, and the Democrats were trying to get Jill Stein off the ballot.
Yeah.
But they both ended up on the ballot because Wisconsin law doesn't provide much of a pathway to get off the ballot once you're on.
But we think the RFK effect is potentially a lot bigger than the Jill Stein effect. But again, close race again. So in 2020, it was 20,000 votes. In 2016, it was like 23,000. In 2004, it was 11,000, and in 2000, it was 5,000. So for the last 6 elections, those are the margins we're talking about. So if it's
only the Obama years were relative blowouts in Wisconsin terms.
So if it's a 5,000 vote election like it was in 2000, then lots of things can make lots of things about our voting system, lots of things about quirky regions of the state, lots of things about third-party candidates, lots of things can affect that outcome.
Okay, since we're on the subject of Hillary Clinton, the blue wall comes up. And the blue wall is still really, seems like the major pathway for Harris to win this race. Okay, so I look at these 3 states, and at the top of the ticket, they seem to lean Democratic. I mean, this state has a Democratic U.S. Senator. She's up, and we'll talk about Tammy Baldwin later, and a Democratic governor. Michigan has 2 Democratic senators and a Democratic governor. Pennsylvania has 2 Democratic senators and a Democratic governor. So will these Democratic-leaning states then somehow not vote for the Democratic nominee?
So that's an interesting way of putting it. And if you do look at, like just to talk about Wisconsin for a minute, if you look at the election history in Wisconsin in the Trump era, like starting with the 2016 election, Democrats have done much better in the Trump era than they did in the Obama era, with the exception of Obama. And that kind of makes sense because, for 4 years you had Trump in the White House and the out party typically does better. But then you had Biden in the White House and Democrats, still, won the gubernatorial election, which was the first time in a very long time that the winning candidate for governor belonged to the same party as the sitting president. I mean, Wisconsin had this thing going where whoever was the party that was in the White House, the other party would win in the midterm for governor. And that didn't happen in 2022. So Democrats have won most of the big statewide elections in the Trump era. And not only that, but the ceiling for Republicans has been considerably lower in the Trump era than it was in the Obama era. I mean, Scott Walker was winning races by 5 or 6 or 7 points. He was getting 52 or 53% of the vote. Ron Johnson was getting 52, 53% of the vote. Since 2016, I mean, since in the wake of since Donald Trump became president and during the Trump and Biden presidencies, the ceiling for Republicans has been just over 50%, and that was Ron Johnson in 2022. And that's even if you include these big judicial races in the spring. So they've had a very narrow path, and I think that is partly explained by the fact the map has changed in Wisconsin and the decline in the suburbs for Republicans, while offset to some degree by the gains in the rural areas, has made it much harder for Republicans to get above 50% because of the way they're performing in the Madison and Milwaukee metropolitan areas. Yeah,
well, Trump plus the abortion issue erodes suburban support and hypes the support in Dane County.
Right, but the suburban trend is pretty powerful. It's been happening across elections. It's been happening for numerous years, and it's sort of following in the footsteps of a national trend. So it's kind of, you would expect it not to just go away because this is what's happening in other states, actually started happening in other states earlier than it happened in Wisconsin. So that's all to say that that's a challenging environment for Republicans, but we've seen Republicans pull out some narrow races, and Donald Trump himself in 2016. So he's had these 2 jump ball elections, but he's never gotten more than like 48% of the vote either. So that's that would be if I were, for Democrats, that would be probably the encouraging fact about recent elections. But the discouraging fact would be, there's a Democratic president who's got terrible job numbers, and he's a drag on the party. And even though he's not the nominee anymore. So it's Biden's fault, right? Okay. So let's talk about you. We talked about this at an event we had in Madison yesterday. Craig wasn't on the panel, but the subject came up about who are these undecided voters? Really, who are they? Because I think a lot of us are going like, how could they be undecided? Yeah. So I mean, can you lay out who they are? Well, not names. I don't want their names. I mean, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but it's kind of like, Charles Franklin, the pollster at Marquette, my colleague, who, referred to them as conflicted partisans and double haters. And again, in our polling, mostly Republicans and independents, mostly moderate. They skew a little bit young, and they're in many cases people that either don't like both candidates, or they're Republicans who have real qualms about. A lot of Republicans have qualms about Donald Trump, but most Republicans are going to vote for Donald Trump. But for some Republicans, those qualms are bigger than they are for other Republicans, and so you've got those conflicted Republicans who really, really don't want to vote for a Democrat, and that's why they may end up voting for Donald Trump, even though they don't like a lot of things about Donald Trump. But then there's this other question, which we talked about, of are they even going to vote? And I think Ken Goldstein, who's a pollster and a political scientist who was at this event that Jeff did yesterday, made the analogy. It's like, the election will be partly decided by people that are very casually engaged in politics. They're not paying a lot of attention. If they were, they probably would know who they were going to vote for. So these people are going to decide, whether they're going to vote, and then they're going to decide who they're going to vote for. But he said it would be like the Super Bowl. What did he say?
The people go to the Super Bowl party and they say, well, now who's playing and who's the quarterback?
They go to the Super Bowl party. They haven't watched a game all year. They're more interested in the ads than the game. Yeah. And so that's a small part of the electorate, particularly in a state like Wisconsin, where turnout's really high and most people are paying attention. But when you get down to a race like this, and you get down to some very polarizing people involved in that race, and people are still undecided, it sometimes means they're just not going to vote.
Okay, and I think Charles put the number at about 6% undecided. And so I had a Democratic strategist tell me about a month ago, he thought that all told, all the races in Wisconsin this cycle, from the assembly on, $250 million spent total in Wisconsin, not just on ads, but all this. And an inordinate amount is being spent on this sliver of the electorate, trying to convince them, persuade them. So is that money well spent?
It's obviously money that campaigns feel like they need to spend. It's incredibly cost ineffective in terms of bang for your buck. I think the mobilization money and the get out the vote money is more efficiently spent. People were predicting the death of political advertising for a very long time, particularly television advertising. And of course, a lot of it's online now, but you have a very fragmented information environment. So it's a lot harder to reach everybody. Maybe it's easier in some ways to reach very targeted audiences, but and because we have a very polarized electorate, a lot of the people that you're reaching have already made up their minds, and so you're not going to have any impact. So there's zillions and zillions of dollars chasing very few eyeballs, and then what percentage of those eyeballs belong to people that are really going to be influenced. But the calculation the campaigns make is if we don't do it and the other side does, then it will have an effect. And that's typically like what a political scientist will tell you, is that when is advertising effective? It's when it's one-sided flow of information. When one side has a big financial advantage, or they're only hearing from one side. And it especially has an effect when it's a down ballot race, because, for president, people have more information and they have stronger opinions than they do for, even though they may be closer to local officials, they don't have as much information about them. They're not in the news all the time. And so the presidential election is like the place where you would be least likely to find advertising playing a decisive role, especially when there's so much money being spent on both sides and it's kind of
you reach a
canceling
point
each
of
other out.
diminishing returns.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about the down ballot races. In your study guide, you will find all the major races in the key races. But I want to talk about the Senate race here. So Tammy Baldwin's the incumbent, first elected in 2012. Eric Hovde ran in the primary that year and lost to Tommy Thompson, who then lost to Tammy Baldwin. And Tammy Baldwin won handily last time 6 years ago against Leah Vukmir. But now this race. And I think that she's the favorite in the race. She's the incumbent, and he hasn't been on the ballot since 2012. And so just recently, though, the Cook Political Report rated this a toss-up race. Did you think that was a good analysis?
Well, I was a little surprised by it, and they may be right, but I have trouble seeing how both the presidential and the Senate race could be toss-ups, because I make the assumption, and it could be wrong, so you don't have to agree with me, but I make the assumption that Tammy Baldwin will perform better than Kamala Harris for a variety of reasons. I mean, her election history, and the person she's running against, Hovde versus Trump. I think Trump is a stronger candidate than, politically than Eric Hovde, and Tammy Baldwin has a history of overperforming in some Republican areas compared to other Democrats. And she's the incumbent, and so that's the assumption I make, is that I don't know what the gap will be between these two races, but typically in the polling, the Democratic margin has been better in the Senate race than in the presidential race, and I think
that's been in many of the swing states too.
Yeah, in many of the swing states too. So I think that's a reasonable assumption to make. But if you make that assumption, then you conclude that for Eric Hovde to win the Senate race, Donald Trump has to win Wisconsin. But then the question becomes, okay, by how much? Does he have to win Wisconsin by 1 point, by 2 points, by 3 points to bring Eric Hovde across the finish line? And that's a question I don't know the answer to, but for that and other reasons, I don't see the Senate race as much of a toss-up as the presidential, but I certainly see it as competitive.
The scenario that I can't imagine is Harris winning and Hovde winning.
Yeah, I can't either.
But I can see somehow that perhaps Trump could win and Baldwin could win if the margins were narrow enough.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
I agree with that. Again, that's just us saying this is the way we look at it, and you can take it or leave it.
We didn't cook that up. I mean, that's
I know we think we have reasons for saying that. I mean, it may be right, it may be wrong, but that's the way we're looking at it, and I think that's the assumption that not just us, but
I would say that
would be the conventional wisdom, I think, in the political world.
Okay, now further down ballot. Okay, before Biden got out of the race, Democrats knew they had a weak incumbent, and they were trying mightily in the state to stir up the grassroots. They were helped by having a new legislative map, and they put candidates in 97 of 99 assembly seats. They put Democrats in all the Senate seats that were up for election. They recruited Peter Barca to run against Brian Stile in the first. They had a competitive primary in the third, recruited Dr. Kristen Lyerly to be the candidate in the eighth, even though that's a pretty Republican district. So they were doing this bottom-up strategy. And then came Harris, and, I think Greta Neubauer, the Assembly Minority Leader, said, she mentioned the possibility that they might be able to win the assembly. So how much are these down ballot races affecting up there?
Yeah, so that's another question about, could the race be close enough that at the top of the ticket that something like this could have an effect on it? And we don't know the answer because it is kind of a new thing. I mean, it's been how long since we had a competitive in a partisan sense legislative maps? You go back to the 2000s. And so that means more activity. There may be Republicans in some districts or some places at the legislative level doing more than they did in the past, but there's also a lot of Democrats in some parts of the state doing more at that level than they did in the past. So there's a lot of activity around that, and that can generate, that could be mobilizing, I think, for voters. I think wouldn't you agree that most people would say that Republicans are favored to maintain the majority, but by possibly considerably narrow margins, right?
Right. They're not going to win back the Senate in one cycle, but
the Assembly.
But narrow, at least there would be narrower margins.
Yeah. And which is interesting, aside from the election effects, because it will be interesting. Let's say we end up with, instead of a 25 seat or 26 seat, whatever it is, Republican margin in the Assembly out of 99 seats, if we end up with a 5 or 6 seat Republican margin or 7 or 8 seat, that's going to have some effect on divided government. I don't know. You probably have some thoughts about what those effects might be.
Well, every lobbyist wants to have one of the houses be Democrat and one of the houses be Republican. That's always the lobbyist stream, because they can
play. We also know from the House, from the Congress, that having a small majority
that has led to chaos.
Can be very chaotic,
and there are scenarios in which that could happen in the state assembly too. If because there are malcontents in that don't like Robin Voss. And if he doesn't get enough seats to cover those folks, then, there could be chaos there, too. But they could also be more united, too. Leaders always talk about sometimes it's easier to unite your caucus when you have fewer members than when you have 60-some, right? Congress. We should talk about Congress. Okay, so the most competitive seat is?
I think the third. We have 2 seats in Wisconsin that on paper are reasonably competitive, and that is the third and the first. So the third being the old Ron Kine, Steve Gunderson district, if you're really going back in time, but that's western Wisconsin, southwestern Wisconsin. It stretches into central Wisconsin. That's a seat that was represented by a very moderate Republican, Steve Gunderson, for years, and then a very moderate Democrat, Ron Kine, for years. It's a swingy part of the state. And then since Ron Kine retired, and in the last 2 cycles, it's been carried by Donald Trump at the presidential level by about 4 points. But I believe Tony Evers in 2022 won the 3rd district by a fraction. A tiny amount. So it's slightly Republican leaning because Tony Evers won by 3 points statewide, but only by a tiny fraction in that district. So it is Republican leaning. And so there is an advantage. You've got a Republican incumbent, Derek Van Orden, but it's a race. It's a competitive race, and Democrats are making an effort, more of an effort than they made 2 years ago. And then in the first, which was the old Les Aspen / Paul Ryan district, which is a really interesting district, because especially it's an unusual Republican district because it has a bunch of Democratic cities in it. Kenosha, Racine, and Janesville. Used to have Beloit, but I think Beloit's out of there now. But it's got a real mix of
right, and then a
real mix of suburbs, rural, and urban.
Ryan and Stile are both from the western part of the district. Yeah. And Barca, the candidate, is from Kenosha.
So, again, I think the Republican incumbent is the favorite in that seat. And so those are uphill races for Democrats, but they're races that I think are potentially within reach under the right circumstances. The rest of the congressional seats, including the 8th, where there is a race, are pretty one-sided districts, either red or blue.
All right, now to the audience. Tom, take over.
Folks, we've carved out some time for people to ask questions. Oh, Marilyn's got her hand up already, but I'm up at the podium, Marilyn, so I get to go first. You guys are probably both familiar now with the new term sane washing, which references how the news media criticisms of how the news media has covered some of Donald Trump's campaign appearances. We saw it again this week when he engaged in the dance party at what was supposed to be a town hall, I believe, in Pennsylvania. I'm just curious about your perspectives. Do you think that's a legitimate criticism, yes or no, of the news media and how they've covered some of those situations?
Why are you looking?
No, I'll do it. I'm happy to take this question. I understand what people are saying. I'm not super persuaded by it. I think the sentiment behind some of the criticism is that people who don't like Donald Trump are frustrated by the fact that he could win. And they're frustrated by the fact that the race is even close. And so there's an argument that if only the media, covered Donald Trump more critically, this wouldn't be the case. I think there's a lot of critical coverage of Donald Trump. I don't think Donald Trump is competitive because there's not enough negative coverage of Donald Trump in the media. That's my opinion. So at a certain point, if you're frustrated with, with the fact that some people are going to vote for Donald Trump despite the way he is and the things he says and does, that's on the voters. I mean, that's, people can see the video. They can make up their own minds. We can't tell them people what to think. So I think that's really, up to the electorate to decide, to weigh all these things, as some people are.
Yeah, I think the normalization is often on the receiving side. Like, what's the definition of news? Something you don't already know. So Donald Trump saying and doing weird stuff is not really, that's not news anymore. People will expect it. So I think that even though it's reported, it's shrugged off and normalized by a lot of people. Like, oh well, there he goes again, whatever. But yes, I mean, this is an extraordinary thing that's going on. And for 10 years, I mean, the news media have been wrestling with how in the world do you cover somebody who says stuff like this? So they, a lot of it is like, well, we're just going to play it for you and you see it. You can see it live and you can consume all that and then you can make your own judgment. And then there are, I mean, there's plenty of critical commentary and coverage. I just think a lot of it is like, shrugged off by a lot of people because, well, they've seen it before.
Yeah. Marilyn.
So I've heard a lot, and I think you have too, about people who vote or supposedly vote on single issue. Abortion being probably the leading one. In Wisconsin, there is not only a tremendous amount of advertising on television and radio about abortion, but more recently I'm seeing and hearing a lot on transgender issues of one or another. Is a single issue voter a real thing, something that can really affect a race, or is it, not quite what some reporters or commentators might want us to think?
So in the Marquette polling, we ask, in most polls, we give people a list of issues and say, what's the most important issue in deciding your vote? And inevitably, the economy is chosen by the most people. That's like 40% maybe. And then the next two issues, which are down a considerable distance, are immigration and abortion. And then after that, you get healthcare, Social Security and Medicare, foreign policy, the war in Gaza, and some other issues. But those are the big ones. And if you look at it by party, you get massive differences. And one example is that a lot of Democrats, say abortion is the issue most important to their vote, but almost no Republicans do, and not a lot of independents do either. And by the same token, on immigration, which is an issue and again, abortion is a favorable issue in the polling to Democrats, to Kamala Harris. Immigration is a favorable issue to Donald Trump, but in the polling, a lot of Republicans put immigration up here, Democrats put it down here, and independents put it down pretty far too. So there are issues that are where you're kind of speaking to the base more than to voters outside your base. And so, you know, I think that diminishes the impact of some of those, you know, what are important issues to a lot of people, but they're not necessarily decisive issues to all the voters who are playing potentially a decisive role in this election.
So I would add two things quickly on the anti-trans ads. One of our panelists yesterday said that was, the alarm bells were going off with the Democratic operatives on those ads, that they were having an effect and they didn't have a ready response on air, in part because there's a clip of Harris saying what she said. On the abortion issue, I think what's really striking is what's going on in the polling, again, in some of the states where it's on the ballot. Abortion rights is on the ballot. There's a measure on the ballot to restore Roe v. Wade, essentially. So Arizona is the one that, the polls out there were like confusing me. So the pro Roe v. Wade thing was polling high. The Senate candidate, Democratic Senate candidate, was leading accordingly, and then Harris was behind Trump by like 6 or 7 points. And I'm going like, that seems off. And, I think Charles's answer to that, I asked Charles about that, and he said, well, I think it shows that somebody can actually, and maybe they're more of a ticket-splitting state than we are right now, right? And, there's a lot of independents, registered independents, and registered Republicans in Arizona. And he was saying that it's conceivable to him that people could vote for the pro Roe v. Wade and then return to the party, their party essentially, to vote for president. Hey, voter behavior is what keeps us talking. It's amazing to me, but I think that state to me was standing out in that regard.
Gentlemen, right here.
Yeah, these are somewhat interrelated, but can you speak to Trump fatigue? He's been in the public here for a long time, and how it affects polling. It somewhat ties to something you said, people growing tired and immune to stuff. And the other would be, this may be morbid, but older white males supporting Trump, how many have died in the last 10 years that are not going to be voting this time? And it's not cold.
Right.
Really. It's not really discussed. I think those are...
Yeah, so I've had this discussion with pollsters about Wisconsin because, okay, we've had these 2 elections that were jump ball elections, but if you're doing the math about what's going to be different, Donald Trump's lost by 20,000 votes last time. He's got to realize a net gain of 20,000 votes in 2024 over the 2020 result. Now, where is that going to come from? It could come from, getting a Biden voter to switch, but it could also come from who's aging into the electorate and who's dying out of the electorate. And that's, probably possible to quantify, which I haven't done in Wisconsin, but yes, you have people who are no longer in the electorate because they're no longer here. You have people that are no longer in the electorate because they've moved to another state. You've got people who have aged into the electorate because they're now 18 or older. You've got people who've moved into the state from somewhere else. And in a state like Wisconsin, the comings and goings are not as dramatic as they are in a place like Arizona. So our electorate is more stable in a sense. But on top of all the decisions that are being made about whether to vote or not, there's a different electorate. And so that's interesting to think about. And I think it's complicated because, some of those, I don't think it's all the people that are aging out of the electorate, to use a euphemism, we're all one way politically, and all the people that are aging into the electorate are not one way politically. In the voting, it's always the polling by age is really tricky, just because these tend to be in small samples in a poll, but one pattern you do see, for example, is a huge gender gap among younger voters this time around. Younger women are very Democratic, and younger men less so, and so there's a big gender gap on this presidential race. There's a lot of chatter about younger men and being, more open to Donald Trump, a lot more open certainly than younger women. So it's not monolithic either way, but it is a factor. And then the Trump fatigue question is a really interesting one because, I think if Kamala Harris can make the argument, I want to turn the page on both Biden and Trump, that's probably her most powerful argument because then she becomes the change candidate. But not everybody's going to buy that argument because she's part of the Biden administration. But then it does bring up the question of Trump fatigue. And, this is the third time. When was the last time we had somebody on the ballot 3 elections in a row? Was it FDR? Am I missing something? And so that's a lot. And that's kind of an X factor too, I think. And his age. So, and part of the people with conflicted feelings about Donald Trump who may want to vote for Donald Trump but may have conflicted feelings about him personally, for some people that conflict is because they may be concerned about his age too.
I think we have time for one more question. Gentleman over here, please.
In that vein of Trump fatigue, is there such a thing as election fatigue in a highly partisan environment where there are pretty attack ads that are pretty personal, where it's inundation? I could get 24 emails and text messages a day, and I may not be atypical. But I'm wondering, if there is such a thing as general election fatigue, does it affect the independents? And if related to that, how does it change the margin of error in the polling? Who's responding to the polls when they're getting hit with all this other information? What is the confidence in that? Do you think it expands the margin of error? So does it exist? Does it affect the independents? Does it affect the polling?
Let me just say something general on voter fatigue. When the stakes are high and people are getting bombarded with messaging, I think it boosts turnout. If the races are close and people know what's at stake. And I think negative ads, one of our friends, Ken Goldstein, studied negative ads for years at UW-Madison, and we all hate them, but sadly they work. Okay.
Well, the corollary to that is that polarization is mobilizing. I did this big dive about 10 years ago into how polarized Metro Milwaukee was, and that was when the red part of Metro Milwaukee, the WOW counties, was getting redder all the time, and the blue part, Milwaukee County, was getting bluer, and the gap between them was growing with every election for decades, and that's no longer the case because the red part is getting less red, not redder. But one of the conclusions I came to, and also talking to political scientists and also just looking at the numbers, was that this polarization was very mobilizing, that in the 1990s, people used to complain about, that was the decade that Bowling Alone was written by Robert Putnam, about disengagement, and a lot of people were wringing their hands about declining voter turnout in the Clinton era. And that, we live in a much more polarized, but also a much more engaged era measured by voter turnout. I mean, our turnouts are bigger. In 2018, we had the biggest midterm turnout we've ever had in Wisconsin. I think 2004 is still the highest presidential turnout percentage-wise, but we came very close in 2020. So that doesn't answer necessarily your direct question about how it affects the polling, and there is fatigue. The question is whether we don't think it stops people from voting. We don't know how it affects people otherwise, other than to drive them slightly insane and demoralize them on some level and throw a rock at their television set.
And on that, let's say thank you to Jeff Mayers and Craig Gilbert. It's a terrific discussion. Thank you very much. Thanks again to our event sponsors and to the Newsroom Pub and Safe House for being a hosting sponsor of this event. Can't let you go without plugging the Milwaukee Press Club. If you're interested in joining, you can apply online at milwaukeepressclub.org. And our next big event is on Friday, October 25th, the Media Hall of Fame dinner and event at right over here at the St. Kate Hotel. Thanks, folks. Appreciate you coming today.